If you've ever been told to watch your blood sugar levels, either because of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes or gestational diabetes, you were probably advised to eat low glycemic index foods. Some of you might even have been told to consider the glycemic load of the foods that you're eating. But what do these terms mean? Glycemic index, glycemic load. Is there a difference between them? Is one better than the other? That is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to define glycemic index and glycemic load. I'm going to explain to you the difference between them. And more importantly, I'm going to explain to you why these numbers or terms may be misleading, especially when it comes to packaged foods that are specifically marketed to people who might have blood sugar problems. Before we dive into this, I'm Dr. Amina, a physician and a health coach, and I help you get normal, stable blood sugar levels without deprivation. And we do this so that you can have great energy levels throughout the day to do whatever it is you want to do, so that you can banish food cravings and avoid weight gain, especially as you grow older, and so that you can have a normally, like an overall healthy, longer life. All right, we're going to get into it. Glycemic index and glycemic load. What are these things? Well, the glycemic index specifically refers to how fast a food increases your blood sugar levels, right? And the glycemic load refers to how much the specific food might increase your blood sugar levels. Okay, so just looking at glycemic index specifically, for example, sugar has a lower glycemic index than bread, and that's because sugar or table sugar is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. So whereas bread is starch, which is a string of glucose molecules. So starch essentially is 100% glucose. So if you have the same amount, gram for gram, of sugar and the same amount of bread, the bread is going to carry up your blood sugar levels faster than the sugar, the table sugar, because you're only getting 50% glucose from the table sugar, where you're getting 100% glucose from the bread. Surprising, isn't it? Because bread isn't sweet, right? I've done videos about this difference between bread and sugar before. But anyway, so that's the comparison there between bread and sugar. Now, if we compare brown rice and white rice, brown rice, or should I say white rice, is going to carry the blood sugar up faster, right, than brown rice, because brown rice has fiber, which slows down the breakdown of the brown rice. So the fiber slows down the breakdown, so your sugar is not going to go up quite as fast as it will with white rice, which doesn't really have any fiber to get in the way of the enzymes breaking down the starch. Okay, so there we have comparison of glycemic index between two different foods and what might make the glycemic index higher for one food compared to the other. Now, moving on to glycemic load, let's look at watermelon. So the glycemic load, we said, is a measure of how much the blood sugar levels increase. So it considers how fast, but also how much. So something like watermelon is a fruit classically known to have a high glycemic index, but at the same time it has a very low glycemic load, because generally speaking, you're not going to have enough watermelon to the point where you're having that much glucose that's going to carry up your blood sugar levels, right? Now, if somebody really binges on watermelon, eventually they might get quite a significant increase in blood sugar level. But generally speaking, watermelon is so water rich, and it has some fiber as well, but especially water, that it's going to fill you before you can eat enough of it to get that significant increase in your blood sugar level. Another thing with a high glycemic index but a low glycemic load is carrots, especially if they're pretty well cooked. You can have it carrying up your blood sugar level quite quickly, right? So fast, but you're not going to eat enough carrots for it to have a significantly, like to have a drastic, it's not going to carry up your blood sugar levels by much. It'll go up fast, but it won't be very much, so it won't be very high, because you have to eat that much more carrots to be able to get that much glucose to go into your system in total, right? So essentially, glycemic index is about the speed of glucose increase, whereas glycemic load is about how much, right? The total amount of glucose that's going to get into your bloodstream, right? Some of you might be curious about the normal ranges. So for glycemic index and even glycemic load, the higher the worse, or the lower the better. So glycemic index of more than 70 is generally high, and there are different charts that you can find on the internet that kind of gives you the glycemic index and even the glycemic load of different foods. So glycemic index of greater than 70 is generally high, glycemic index of 59 to 69 is moderate, and then less than 55 or less is going to be a low glycemic index food. For glycemic load greater than 20 is high, and then 19 to 11 is moderate, and 10 and less is going to be a low glycemic index food. Now, where it gets tricky, so I said, how can we be misled by glycemic index and glycemic load of different foods, right? So where it gets tricky, right? Glycemic index, yes, you might be having a food that's marketed as low glycemic index, and we see these in the diabetic section at the supermarket, where they have so many different processed foods that are marketed as low glycemic index. But what they don't tell you is that these foods are very easy to overeat. So you're going to end up eating lots of these foods. So in the end, though these foods specifically marketed to diabetics are low glycemic index, right? They're not necessarily going to carry your blood sugar very fast, right? But you're going to eat lots of them because they're so addicted. So you're going to end up getting a very significant, it is going to carry your blood sugar a lot in the end, because whereas a diabetic cookie might, the serving, if you're going to look at the label, it might only be two cookies per serving. They make the cookie taste so nice that you might eat 6 cookies or 8 cookies depending on what it is. Okay, so in the end, even though ordinarily you shouldn't have a very quick increase in your blood sugar levels, because you eat so much of the cookies or so many of the cookies, you're going to end up getting lots of glucose going into your bloodstream, right? And this is how it's really tricky, because the glycemic index is what you're told especially to focus on, but then the load, how much of this low glycemic food are you going to eat? You're going to end up eating a lot because it's very addictive, and this is especially when it comes to those foods, processed foods that are in the factory. For glycemic index, another thing is that the glycemic index, we said, is how fast a food is broken down, and the sugar or glucose gets into your bloodstream depends on it depends on a lot of factors, like, are you chewing the food well? If you're chewing the food very well and it's going into small pieces, it means it's going to be easy for the digestive enzymes to get in and break down and between the bonds and release the glucose into your bloodstream. Another thing is that the microbiome, the normal bacteria in our intestines, varies from person to person, and the microbiome mix also determines how quickly a food is broken down and gets absorbed into your bloodstream. Okay. Also, some people have different concentrations of stomach acid. Some people have different concentrations of digestive enzymes coming from their pancreas and so on. Some people have different amounts of bile coming in. So the digestive process is different for different people, and for that reason, it will vary. So 5 different people can eat the same amount of the same food and have 5 totally different glucose readings 2 hours after they eat the meal, right? So a lot of factors, of course, too. Insulin, how well does your insulin work? That also, the degree of the degree of efficiency with which your insulin works, otherwise known as whether or not you're insulin resistant, that is also going to determine how much, or the glycemic index of a food or food overall. So there are many different factors, and looking at a table and expecting that you're going to have the same response as the table says can be quite misleading. And then, like I said, glycemic index is one thing, but then the glycemic load, if we're not taking into consideration how much of this low glycemic index food that you're eating, then ultimately you can still run into major problems with your blood sugar going forward, right? What do you do? Back in the day, nobody looked at glycemic load, nobody looked at glycemic index. People just ate their food. But the thing is, back in the day, people ate mostly unprocessed food that came straight from the land and the sea, right? We didn't have all these foods from the factory, right? So what I generally suggest is that you try to make most of the food that you eat, as much as you can, be fresh food as much as you can, or food that is minimally processed, because those foods that are minimally processed or unprocessed are much less addictive. So you're much less likely to overeat those foods, especially foods that have still a lot of fiber, and even food that still has a lot of the naturally occurring fat. You're not likely to overeat, or you're less likely to overeat them, because you're going to get full faster, and so it's going to be an automatic stop when your body has had enough, right? Compare that to if you're eating mostly processed foods that were designed specifically to be addicted. And these processed foods also, they're very easily broken down, very easily digested, because you can say they were pretty much pre-digested in the factory, lots of little parts put together. So it's really easy for your body to just break them down very quickly, and you're gonna get very high blood sugar readings. So high blood sugar readings very fast, right, with these processed foods. So if you don't want to worry about glycemic index and glycemic load, which I don't want to worry about those things, just focus on the foods as they came from nature, from the land and the sea, and avoid those foods from the factory, and don't fall for fancy labels and proclamations from the different companies telling you it's safe to eat these foods. In fact, if something says it's diabetic friendly, you probably should avoid it, because there might be too much done to it that will cancel out those so-called friendly effects. I hope you all found this video helpful, and if you did find it helpful, please do share it with somebody else who you think might benefit from this knowledge. Thanks for watching, and bye.